All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Socialist Action webinar for tonight. We're going to be talking about the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. There's been some really interesting updates on his case recently, so we're really glad you can join us today. We do these webinars every 2 weeks. So come back and check us out. They're Wednesday evenings. So we'll have another one on June 23rd. And that one we're going to celebrate LGBTQ Pride Month. So we have some really great speakers for that lined up. We hope you can join us for that. If you like these videos and want to hear more about socialist action, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel because we'll be posting regularly on here. We also have a great website and a lot of articles posted on there regularly. So if you're interested in learning more about our views on different topics, feel free to check out our website at socialistaction.org. So yeah, tonight we're gonna hear from Jeff Mackler. He's the National Secretary of Socialist Action, and he's also the director of the Mobilization to Free Mumia Abu-Jamal. So he's worked on Mumia's case for 35 years. He's an expert on the case. We're really excited to have him here with us tonight. So while you're listening, feel free to post any questions or comments that you might have in the chat box, because Jeff will be able to answer some of those questions later on after we hear from him about the latest updates on Mumia's case. So without further ado, Jeff, go ahead.
Thank you, Lisa. Glad to be with you. I'm going to start with an update on the case and then explain the case as a whole. We're only having an update because after 30 years of litigation, where Mumia beat back 2 orders by the state of Pennsylvania to execute him. In response to that, we organized demonstrations by coastal with 25,000 each in San Francisco and the Philadelphia area, Mumia's hometown. We are convinced that the reason why Mumia Abu-Jamal is alive today is because we built a mass movement that made the price of his frame up and execution too high to pay by the powers that be. And believe me, the powers that be arrayed against Mumia ranged from the entire judicial, police, state, and court apparatus of the state of Pennsylvania on up through the US Supreme Court. So why are we here today? We're here because after Mumia had lost all of his appeals, we were surprised when the US Supreme Court ruled a couple of years ago that in death penalty cases, a prosecutor who subsequently becomes a member of the Supreme Court can't rule on the case that he prosecuted. And in Mumia's case, the Ron Castile, who was the prosecutor for Philadelphia, the district attorney at the time, subsequently, and tried to kill Mumia, subsequently became a member of the Supreme Court and refused to, at our request, refused to recuse himself and voted against all Mumia's appeals. So based on that, we won, or we thought we had won, the right to relitigate the key issues in the case that we were banned from appealing. Now, I should say that the state of Pennsylvania challenged that ruling, and it went before a local judge at the lowest level court, the first Black judge involved in Mumia's case, and he upheld the Supreme Court decision and guaranteed us the right to present the issues that we had been banned from presenting. Of course, the state of Pennsylvania challenged that. And today we are still in the court system where all issues are referred back to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. That is the key issues that were denied us when we originally appealed to the Supreme Court. Now, of course, let me state this. when we won that Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court victory, the prosecution, headed by Ron Castile, who's a Supreme Court justice, claimed, well, they really don't have any standing in the case because Ron Castile, then district attorney, really wasn't involved in the case in the first place. So he wasn't really part of the prosecution. And it took us months to disprove that, including literally having someone in the higher echelons of the court system in Philadelphia find in an obscure place in the court system 6 boxes of literature that had been kept from the defense. And our lawyer, Judith Ritter, hands and knees and jeans, went through the 6 boxes and sure enough, came up with the proof that Judge Castile was no innocent bystander. In fact, he was critical in trying to prevail on the courts to execute cop killers like Mumia Abu-Jamal. So we're back in court. Our attorneys are NAACP appointed Judith Ritter and her teammate. But let's go back to day one on this. Here we have Mumia Abu-Jamal, an award-winning journalist, Peabody Award journalist, voted the most likely to be the next major anchor in the news media in the Philadelphia area, having dinner with a local congressman, and then proceeding in a taxi cab because he had been forced out of his journalism job for political reasons, going to pick up a ride at 13th and Locust in downtown at 2 o'clock in the morning. He was allowed to carry a gun because he had been robbed as a cab driver. It was a part-time job, and he had a gun in his car. As he approached 13th and Locust, he came across an unusual scene, and that is he saw police officer Daniel Faulkner with a 14-inch flashlight clubbing his brother, Billy, over the head. He approached the scene, unarmed in our view, and was shot by Faulkner several times, but not before a confrontation between Faulkner and Mumia, where the police officer, where the police argued that Mumia literally stood above Faulkner with a loaded gun and emptied it point blank range, standing over Faulkner 4 or 5 times until he finally killed Faulkner. And as Faulkner was falling to the ground, he shot upwards at Mumia, and both Faulkner and Mumia lay in the pavement. Now, what really happened? Because this is just the police version. And since we're talking about the police, let me make a couple of points. The Philadelphia Police Department was, according to the US Justice Department and FBI, the most corrupt in the United States. Their corruption brought on a major investigation by the Justice Department that resulted in some dozen police officers in Philadelphia brought to trial and convicted of everything from drug laundering, prostitution, and other illegal activities. This was a national scandal in the city of Philadelphia because the police department was headed by police officer Frank Rizzo, who subsequently became mayor. And the journalist at the time who was most studious in covering the police trials was Mumia Abu-Jamal, who daily attended the press conferences and the legal proceedings against the police officers, to the point where this well-known, popular, innocent journalist with a 0 record of arrests was reporting on the scene during the prosecution of the Philadelphia Police Department. And his reporting was so critical that Frank Rizzo, the chief of police, publicly stated that they were going to hold Mumia Abu-Jamal responsible for his coverage of the legal proceedings against the Philadelphia Police Department. And lo and behold, Mumia became their victim years later at that 13th and Locust in downtown Philadelphia. So what really happened? Well, let's start from the beginning. The police claimed that police officer Faulkner on the ground pulled out his revolver and shot up at Mumia Abu-Jamal. The subsequent ballistics material showed that the bullet that entered Mumia's body didn't come from down below, but rather were fired above him, entered his chest, and lodged in his lower back. So that put the lie immediately. Of course, we weren't able to present this evidence to the courts. And when we finally did, we asked for an explanation of Faulkner. The so-called eyewitnesses said that Faulkner was shooting from the ground up. What happened? And the police answered, well, it's obvious. What happened was that the bullet ricocheted on some bone in Daniel Faulkner's body and then headed in downward direction. Well, we did subsequent tests. I'm talking about, MRI type tests on the body of Mumia, and there was only one trajectory. There was no indication that any bone, any change in direction of the bullet. So that was a fabrication. What else happened on the scene? Well, Deborah Kordansky, looking from an apartment building in the scene, said that the two shooters ran away while Mumia Abu-Jamal laid on the ground alongside or close to Daniel Faulkner. Who were these two shooters? Well, we never knew right away because Deborah Kordansky was not allowed to testify. She told the police what she saw, but she said she didn't want to help a black man. She subsequently testified that two shooters ran away. Well, who were the two shooters? The first thing was that on the murder scene itself, they had a taxi cab driver who claimed that he had pulled his cab directly behind Billy Cook's car, which was where Mumia's brother and another passenger in the car were located. But subsequently, Pedro Polikoff, who was the first on the scene, an award-winning reporter, showed that there was no taxi cab on the scene. And the taxi cab driver who was brought into court to testify that he saw Mumia had no taxi cab where he said it was located. And further, he plea bargained his testimony. And that is, he was convicted, he was driving without a license, and he had been convicted of throwing a Molotov cocktail on a schoolyard. That never came to the jury's attention. He was given a private deal that if he would lie about what he saw at the murder scene or at the death scene, he would be allowed to continue driving a cab and without his license. So much for the taxi cab that didn't exist. Cynthia White was supposedly on the scene, and she said she saw Mumia shoot Faulkner. Well, it turned out she wasn't on the scene as well. And she subsequently testified that she had lied, that she had been pressed as a prostitute to lie in return for continuing her practice, being supervised by Philadelphia cops, I should add. So her testimony was discredited. Now, the first thing the police do at a murder scene is if they have a suspect, they test their hands to see if they'd fired a gun. And they should have tested Faulkner's clothing to see if he had residue of a gun fired at close range, because they claimed that Mumia shot him. Well, they never tested Mumia's hands to see if he had fired a gun. And neither did they test Faulkner's clothing to see if the charge that Mumia fired the gun into Faulkner was true. Now, the police searched the scene, and they did find in Billy Cook's car, in fact, Billy Cook gave it to them, a driver's license, and they withheld the name of the driver, the driver's license, until after the trial was over. We only found out that there was a driver's license in the vest pocket of police officer Faulkner, who supposedly had stopped Billy Cook, and Billy Cook gave him this driver's license. Well, the driver's license belonged to a friend who the police immediately investigated, a person, not a friend, who was miles away working at a 7-Eleven shop. And he claimed that he had given his driver's license to one Kenneth Friedman, who was Mumia's brother's partner. They ran a small stand selling trinkets on the street, and the two of them were in the car that night. But police claim that the murder scene had no one but Billy Cook, Mumia's brother, Mumia, and Faulkner. That was the police argument. There was no Kenneth Friedman. But subsequently, during Billy Cook's separate trial, where he was convicted of assault, a minor assault, the trial testimony included the fact that there was another passenger in the car, which the police denied. So it was another lie. Deborah Kordansky claimed that two people fled the scene. She didn't say who they were, but one of them was Billy Cook, who returned to give aid to his brother Mumia, who lay on the ground. And the other was Kenneth Freeman. He was a family friend and a business partner. And that family friend, apparently, we don't know for sure, was at the murder scene. And he saw police officer Faulkner clubbing his friend, Mumia's brother, viciously with a 14-inch flashlight, and he shot Faulkner and ran away. Well, Kenneth Freeman was never brought to trial. The police totally ignored him, and he was found months, if not years later, stripped naked and dead at the day of the MOVE bombing. The MOVE organization was the organization that Mumia had favorably covered for a long, long while. So I could go into the details of the case, but what was obvious was that the police organized a frame-up at the murder scene. Not only a frame-up, but when they finally arrived on the murder scene, they picked up Mumia, they put him on a stretcher, they rammed his head into a lamppost, and they threw him into an awaiting police van. The officer in charge reported, his name was Alphonse Giordano, that when thrown in the van, Mumia Abu-Jamal confessed to the murder of Faulkner. That is, that Mumia said, yeah, I'm glad I killed the motherfucker. So here you have the police with a murder weapon, supposedly Mumia's weapon. There was no evidence that it had been fired. You had a confession by Mumia Abu-Jamal, and you had eyewitnesses. Those three elements proved to be decisive, even though they were all falsified at the time of the jury. So let's talk about Giordano first. He was in charge of the murder scene, but they never presented his testimony that Mumia had confessed, because Giordano was one of the several Philadelphia police that was indicted and convicted of criminal activity as part of the Justice Department FBI investigation. So they didn't feel he was credible. So they needed another eyewitness. And lo and behold, Mumia was taken to Jefferson Hospital. He was put in an isolated room. The police entered the room, and one officer, and he was near death, one officer put his foot on the drainage bag to try to force the fluids back up into Mumia's body and try to kill him once again. A medical officer was with Mumia the entire time. And that medical officer stated point blank, a doctor at the hospital, that the male Negro made no comments. And yet, two police officers, one of them Faulkner's partner, testified some 90 days after the incident that they had forgotten that they had heard Mumia confess, yeah, I killed the motherfucker. So a second confession that was admitted by the courts 90 days later, even though all of the officers at the murder scene in the hospital were called together at the time and asked if they had anything to say about what happened. And these two cops who claimed a second confession for Mumia forgot at the time. They said they were in a state of shock, and they conveniently remembered later on. So everything from, and by the way, I forgot to say that when the police went to the 7-Eleven station to talk to the person whose driver's license was found on Faulkner's body, they immediately tested his hands to see if he had fired a gun. And sure enough, he hadn't. But they didn't bother to test Mumia's hands or Faulkner's clothes to see if he had fired a gun. Next, the trial itself. I mentioned Ron Castile, the district attorney. He was infamous for a number of reasons, but the most horrendous was the fact that he produced on his own, in the name of the state of Pennsylvania, a video explaining to prosecutors on how to exclude blacks from juries, on the grounds that blacks were less likely in murder cases to convict other blacks. So here we presented as part of the evidence a prejudicial prosecutor who consciously organized to have prosecutors exclude blacks from prison. And if you had to have some blacks, he said, better that they be from another country, perhaps Jamaica or somewhere else. So almost all of the black jurors were excluded from Mumia's trial. And one woman who was black, a younger black woman, went home to feed her cat as the trial, as the jury selection was in progress. And they said she did so without permission, and they dismissed her from the jury. But when a white juror said that he had to renew his driver's license or something, the police gave him an escort back and forth and didn't exclude him. So most of the blacks were excluded in a city with a heavy black population, in accord with the violation of the Batson decision, saying it's illegal to exclude blacks from a jury, and any resulting conviction can be appealed. In every case, when we raised all of these issues, Judge Sabo ruled against us. Over 100 times, this Judge Sabo, Albert Sabo, was known as the hanging judge. Not the National Lawyers Guild, which is a left-wing, leftist legal organization, but the major Philadelphia-based lawyers' national organization had stated that no one can get a fair trial in Sabo's court. And indeed, a court stenographer who was in the antechambers of Judge Sabo's courtroom with another judge present, prior to Judge Sabo litigating the case, reported Judge Sabo as saying, yeah, I'm going to help him fry the nigger. By the way, Judge Sabo was a member of the Fraternal Order of Police that has been conducting a campaign for 35 years to execute Mumia Abu-Jamal. So here you have a racist judge, Albert Sabo, saying he's going to help the prosecution fry, using the N-word. And when we brought that to court, the judge in that case said, well, that is reprehensible that the judge would say something like that. But there was no evidence of prejudice in the proceedings itself. That is, a racist bigot who announced that he was going to help the police, unchallenged in his testimony, fry the N-word, fry Mumia, was found to be without prejudice in the proceedings, even though he had Mumia physically tied and gagged and then removed from a majority of his own trial. because Mumia insisted on the right to defend himself, which was rejected. So everything ranging from the eyewitnesses, all of whom basically had spurious testimony, to the ballistics, to the bullet, to the attempt twice to kill Mumia, to the false confessions and the exclusion of Black jurors, one issue after another won Mumia international support, to the point, for example, where the NAACP has demanded a new trial, the Amnesty International has demanded a new trial, the European Parliament has voted for a new trial, the Japanese Diet, some 18 US unions, including the Longshore that closed down the ports in 1999, demanding a new trial in the freedom of Mumia Abu-Jamal. We're not talking about some weird guy with a funny name. We're talking about a classic system of racist abuse in a criminal justice system that had been condemned by the government of the United States itself, by the FBI, and by the Justice Department, who convicted these officers. Mumia is an innocent man on death row. His life rests in our capacity to build a massive, united, nationwide movement demanding his freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that great background on the trial. Really comprehensive. So when you were talking about Mumia's case and just the corruption in the police department in Philadelphia, it just brought to mind all the protests that we've been seeing. I live in Minneapolis, and so we've been seeing so many protests related to police brutality and police killings today that the death of George Floyd sparked, and then we've seen continued protests. Not just here in Minnesota, but they spread across the country and across the world. So clearly, this is not an isolated incident or an isolated problem, or the issue of just a few bad cops here and there. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the relevance of Mumia's case today, and what is the connection between his case and then all of the protests that we've been seeing against police brutality?
Well, the connection is highlighted by the statistics, by the facts that have come to our attention in the last year. The most startling fact is that, on average, an unarmed Black man is murdered by police every day of the week. Every day of the week. And that doesn't count the number of white working class people. So the George Floyd situation in Minneapolis was unusual because his murder by the racist cop was videotaped. In Mumia's case, we had tons of witnesses proving he was innocent, not to mention the fact that he was having dinner with a congressman and that he was an award-winning journalist. They wanted to put him away, and they thought they could do it with impunity, in the same way that they basically approved the police murder of Breonna Taylor and Michael Brown and all of the others across the United States who are open victims of police murder. Racism is inherent in the criminal justice system. And in fact, what George Floyd revealed was that we live in a society of systemic racism. And not a day passes when that isn't demonstrated in yet more and more statistics. Just recently, they pointed out that Black farmers, for example, received, under the same circumstances, received qualitatively less money in loans and lost their property to white big business farmers. The same thing with every institution in society. When measured Black against white, the Black population receives the short end of justice repeatedly and everywhere. It took a couple 100 years for the United States government itself to recognize that the portraits and statues of racist, bigots, slave-owning segregationists should be taken down from the halls of Congress, not to mention lining the streets of major cities in the country. That is, the people who not only broke the Union, but fought a war to maintain slavery are being honored and are honored to this day across the country. That racism is inherent in the system only became an admitted fact when 20 million, some say 25 million people last summer in 2,000 plus cities mobilized to demand Black Lives Matter. Because before that, Black lives were taken with impunity. Police testimony, according to the laws, had to be given credibility. Any cop could simply claim, I was in fear of my life, like the Adam Toledo case, where a 13-year-old was gunned down with his hands held high, and the police said, well, they thought he was carrying a gun and that he was in danger. And they immediately smeared him with the label that he was a Chicago gang-banging teenager, and his life was taken as well. So the George Floyd in Minneapolis case brought to life, along with all of the other cases from one end of the country, the basic idea that you can't reform a racist police system. The cops today are the heirs of the former slave patrols, those who were assigned legally in the South with Northern agreement to hunt down escaped slaves as illegals. And in the post-slavery period, Blacks were literally arrested on, quote, loitering charges and put in jails and then shipped back to the plantation to work as free laborers on plantations owned by the former segregationists. Racism goes deep in American society. The fact that it's been exposed is because of the mass mobilizations of disbelief in anything that the police say. Mumia's case, we used to call it the, quote, Mumia exception, because every law that we cited to say that Mumia didn't get a fair trial, that Blacks were excluded, that there were no ballistics tests, that the judge was racist, the courts found a way out, a way to justify the system, a way to justify the cop who became the mayor, Frank Rizzo, a racist cop. In fact, it's interesting that Rizzo's statue in downtown Philadelphia was just taken down. And in my opinion, the Mumia case, not to mention the mass movement for Black Lives Matter, is part of it. So Mumia's case is ongoing. It's symptomatic of everything that we know for a fact in George Floyd's case, in every other case across the country, where Blacks are murdered with impunity by white racist cops who believe they have the right to take the law into their own hands because the laws themselves are written to defend anything they do.
Thanks, Jeff, for that great explanation. We're going to go to a question from the audience. What is Mumia's background before being a radio journalist, and why is this significant to his lifelong incarceration as a political prisoner?
Well, Mumia was a college student. I believe he took journalism at, I think it was Bard College, and he became a journalist for an important radio station. He was awarded because of his insights. He has an extremely deep baritone voice and very thoughtful and well-researched. He had an NPR show, which the prosecutors and others, National Public Radio, and he was forced off the air by right-wing bigots in Congress that didn't want National Public Radio to broadcast Mumia Abu-Jamal. He has written at least 9, if not 10 books. His publisher, recently deceased, Francis Golden, was his literary agent. He's wonderful human being. I visited Mumia twice in prison, and I was surprised that he had read many of the books and knew many of the writers that I grew up with. He was reading a book called The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, which shows the history of the Haitian Revolution against the French government, a revolution that eliminated slavery, led by a Black slave, Toussaint Louverture. He was familiar with socialist literature, with civil rights. As a 13-year-old, he worked on the Black Panther Party newspaper in Oakland, California, and left the Panther Party as it basically disintegrated into warring factions promoted by the police infiltration. So Mumia has written histories of the Black Panther Party. He's currently in prison. We got him off death row because of improper jury instructions when we finally won a case saying that the instructions to the jury requiring that they be unanimous, or that they didn't have to be unanimous in finding him guilty, were improper. The prosecution in Philadelphia had a choice. They could have given us a new trial, or they could have accepted that the instructions on the death penalty were flawed, and they would give him life imprisonment. So rather than risk a new trial where all the evidence of innocence could be presented, the state of Pennsylvania decided to take him off death row, and he is now in serving a life sentence. He has done some amazing things. When the first opportunity was presented to him, when the major media came to interview him at a critical point in his defense, and it was Associated Press or the major reporters were organizing a strike, Mumia refused to testify to the media on his own case because he didn't want to be complicit with crossing a Union picket line. That is, with having people cross a picket line to interview him. He's currently working on a PhD at UC Santa Cruz, in University of California at Santa Cruz, in south of San Francisco. He has his books have been well received, and they talk about life on death row, political issues, historical issues, well researched, and he has been asked to be the commencement speaker at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. A decade ago, he was the commencement speaker at the request of the graduating class at UC Santa Cruz and other universities. So he's quite a well-known figure, an intellectual, an honest man, pro-union, anti-racist fighter with socialist views. And there isn't an issue that he doesn't comment on. You can read or watch his videos in prison radio, or check out our newspaper for articles on Mumia's case. That's socialistaction.org.
Thanks, Jeff. Let's wrap up with one final question. So you mentioned that the most important thing we can do for Mumia right now is, build a mass mobilization in his defense. And I know that you've been part of that movement for decades. So what can we do to support Mumia's case today?
Well, the most important thing is to join the struggle for Black Lives Matter and the periodic demonstrations that we have for Mumia's freedom and all political prisoners. I first heard about the case when his then attorney, Leonard Weinglass, came to speak at San Francisco State. And at the time, nobody ever heard of him. Who is this fellow imprisoned among thousands? By the way, the United States has the largest number and percentage of people of its population in prison than any nation on earth. That in itself is a statement that there's something fundamentally racist in the system. The majority of people are Black, Latino, and Native American. But Mumia's case was presented by Leonard Weinglass when we had trouble pronouncing his name. who is this Mumia Abu-Jamal? We didn't know what his nationality was or anything else. We thought he was just a stranger. But Leonard Weinglass taught us a lesson. He said, if we're going to win his freedom, it's not just going to be by legal arguments. It's going to be by building an irrepressible mass movement in the streets demanding freedom for Mumia Abu-Jamal. So we spent decades getting out the information. And I mean, at one point in California, we had Mumia as a speaker at every high school in the Bay Area. We had the Oakland Education Association organizing teach-ins through the school system where Leonard Weinglass appeared before classes to talk about the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. We had the Berkeley and San Francisco City Council pass resolutions for the freedom of Mumia Abu-Jamal. We had the Longshore Strike literally closing down the port to lead a demonstration of 25,000 that our mobilization to free Mumia Abu-Jamal called. So by calling public attention, by demanding justice and freedom for Mumia Abu-Jamal, by building a mass movement in the streets against racist police brutality and against this criminal justice system as it functions, we have the best chance of freeing Mumia. I'm confident that we will see the day where Mumia is a free man. And I'll tell you, that day will be a day celebrated around the world. And I mean that. France has named the main street that goes to the largest stadium in Europe, Rue Mumia Abu-Jamal. The city council there did that. Mumia fought off not only 2 orders of execution, but he came down with a terrible liver ailment, and they refused treatment. We had a big battle and we won that. And not only that, but the state of Pennsylvania was forced to give hepatitis C treatment to everyone else. It's the same thing. Mumia survived COVID-19 only after we had a major fight to give him medical care. And more recently and tragically, they refused him medical care and we fought to get it. And Mumia just months ago had open heart surgery and survived it. So every battle to have doctors that could see him, to get proper medical care, has been hard fought. In every case, the police wanted to kill him. Every time we file an appeal, Maureen Faulkner, the wife of Daniel Faulkner, files a counter appeal under spurious grounds, if for no other reason, to delay the proceedings so death can approach Mumia through his own physical ailments, heart ailments, skin problems, and others that long-term incarceration bring on to all people, not to mention people on death row where Mumia spent most of his time. So basically, join the struggle for Mumia's freedom. Form a coalition to defend Mumia Abu-Jamal. Get the word out, publish articles, check it out on website, familiarize yourself with the facts. I've done several national tours for Mumia. There's a national movement operating in cities across the country for Mumia. We've had tribunals. We're organizing teach-ins, seminars. We include Mumia in every struggle because a victory for Mumia would be akin to the victory that Nelson Mandela won after 38 years in prison by the racist US-backed South African apartheid regime. Free Mumia Abu-Jamal, free all political prisoners. And thank you, Lisa, and Socialist Action. If you're interested in joining us, check us out at socialistaction.org. You can contribute online to us, sign up to be part of our live streaming, and join our next meeting in 2 weeks where we celebrate Gay Pride Month.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us tonight about the important case. Please subscribe to our channel, and we'll be back in 2 weeks to celebrate the LGBTQ movement. So that will be June 23rd, same time, 7:30 p.m. Central Time. We hope to see you there, and have a great evening.